Installing Active Directory. In this nugget, we'll be talking about installing Active Directory. And you might think to yourself, well, James, didn't we do that in the last nugget? Yes, we did, but we're going to do it in a few different ways here. For example, in the last nugget, we did install Active Directory, but now we need to maybe install additional domain controllers for purposes of load balancing and to make sure that you have a failover solution in case one of the domain controllers goes down. We also have the child domain that we might install here as well. In this case, we'll install west.nuggetlab.com. I talked to you about a tree architecture earlier in the last nugget, so we will be doing that as well. And then we'll talk also about upgrading. This is a lengthy process, and it involves several reboots throughout the process. But it's not necessarily to go through each individual step of upgrading. It's really pretty simple. The main thing to keep in mind here is that we need to prepare the schema. I'll show you how to do that so that you can have a successful upgrade. Also, we'll talk about removing Active Directory. You might need to do that if you need to decommission a server. Maybe it's old hardware that you were going to dispose of or something like that, and you need to remove Active Directory from it. Certainly, you need to remove Active Directory rather than just disconnect it from the network and dispose of the server, because the rest of Active Directory, all the other peer domain controllers and everybody else, all the other servers in the forest, are going to expect to see that domain controller, and if you don't properly remove it, those other domain controllers will get confused. In the last nugget, we took a look at installing a domain controller, and we did just kind of a basic installation. Well, guess what I did? I actually uninstalled the domain controller. Now, how do I do that? I just ran DC promo, and then it takes you through a handy little wizard, which you just next finish your way through, and it's pretty simple. But why did I uninstall that role? Because I wanted to show you a couple of other ways of installing it, and one of them I alluded to in our last session. That makes it sound like we had therapy together or something like that. You know, it's probably, by the time you're done with this, you might need therapy. But anyhow, I decided to go ahead and create a text file this time so that I can show you how that's done. Now, I showed you in the last nugget that at the end of the wizard, you can export it to a text file, and that's what I've done here. And I just named it here, DC promo install forest root. Just to make it sense for myself. Also, I'm going to make this file available for you up on nuggetlab.com. So this is a public internet website that you can use to download accompanying files and support files for all of the nuggets that we create, the videos that we create here at CBT Nuggets. So anyway, this is what it looks like, and it also gives you the usage right here, which makes it real handy to be able to use. In fact, I'm just going to select on that and copy that, and I'm going to actually use it in the command line. And then we have just the sections here, DC install. It's going to be a replica or a domain. It's going to be a domain installation in a new forest, and this is the name of the domain. And it's going to be Forest Level 2, which means it's going to be Windows Server 2003 DFL, or Forest Functional Level, FFL. Then Domain Net BIOS name is Nugget Lab. We didn't really see that in the wizard last time, but if you go to the advanced options in the wizard, you can see that or expose that option. We don't really need it in the wizard we did, so I didn't show it to you. Then we also have Domain Level 2, which is also going to be Windows Server 2003. We're going to install DNS. We're going to make it a global catalog. We're going to not create a DNS delegation because we don't have other DNS servers that we're trying to reference here. We're going to create DNS zone from scratch. We have the file paths for all of our database, log path, and sysvol. And then what we're going to do is to set the safe mode administrative password to kind of a default password that we use here in Nugget Land, where we're just going to meet the complexity requirements and length, and that's just kind of a common password that we might see from time to time. Also, it's going to be rebooting upon completion, so that's what we've got going on right there. Now, I'm just going to go ahead and launch this. By the way, you might wonder how I got the command prompt to appear just suddenly like that. Let me cancel out of this and show you. I just adjusted the shortcuts to my accessories command prompt here, where I right-click on it and choose Properties. And within this, I changed it to not start in the profile. By default, it starts in the currently logged on user's profile, but I like to go to the root of C. Makes the command prompt shorter and simpler. And plus, I hardly ever want to be in that profile. And then I just used a shortcut key, Control-Alt-M. I'm also in the options, going into quick edit mode here, which means it allows me to more quickly and easily copy and paste. So, Control-Alt-M pops that open. By right-clicking in quick edit mode, it just pops in my unattended item that I copied out of the text file that we saw a moment ago. And then, as soon as I press enter, it's going to go ahead and launch the installation. Now then, here I kind of fast-forwarded. You've seen the installation before, so I didn't elaborate on that quite a lot. I just let the answer file do its work. It restarted the computer. Server Manager launches as soon as you log on, and then I've already gone here to the Domain Controller's organizational unit to show you that this very computer that you're looking at right now is listed as a Domain Controller. So it looks like everything installed just fine. Now then, the next thing I want to do is to make a remote desktop connection to another server on my network. Remote desktop connection is simply where I can start kind of a little terminal services session to another system. This means that I get the entire desktop of that remote system, but I don't have to be seated locally at that computer. And that's very handy if I want to administer something that's in a different building or look at something halfway across the globe, for example. In our case, I do have this other system actually pretty close to me, but I want to use this one screen to do all the recording from, so I want to go ahead and show it to you using a remote desktop. Also, the other machines that I have running for purposes of our training and our creating of our CBT nuggets are all going to be located within virtual machines. This is becoming a very common practice among administrators so that we can have high density server space. This means then that I might have a very powerful server with maybe 2 processors or 4 processors on it, lots of hard drive space, lots of memory, but if I have a simple role or service installed on it, it's way overpowered for simply that one role that it might have. So what I can do is use something like a VMware product, or Microsoft also has Hyper-V, which is included with Windows Server 2008. Or they also have Virtual PC, which is another product that can be used. Anyway, there's several products now that we can use to virtualize. This means that we can install multiple operating systems or multiple instances of an operating system on a single piece of physical hardware. So instead of having to have separate desktop computers for each installation, I can have high density with multiple installations in one computer. Now, I'm going to go ahead and make my connection to 10.10.10.71 and enter in a password over there. This is just a workstation, or rather a server, that is not a member of a domain. You can see right here that it's a member of a work group, and I get the full desktop, and I can pretty much administer it as if I were seated locally at that computer. Now what I'm going to do here is I'm going to install the domain controller here. You see I've got an answer file here, but the first thing I'll do is I'll once again show you the command prompt method for being able to do this, just by going to DC Promo. And this is just like we saw in the last nugget. You can do this from a command line or a run or the search item. And then I'm going to simply just go ahead and do a simple installation here. We'll use advanced mode for some other things later on. But I'm going to go through the same steps that you saw earlier, but this time I'm going to choose an existing forest, and I'm going to add a domain controller to an existing domain. This means that it will be a peer domain controller. I can also choose a new domain in an existing forest, and this might be the case if I wanted to create west.nuggetlab.com or something like that. But for my current purposes, just another domain controller in this existing domain, and the purpose for that is for failover purposes, so that if one domain controller goes down, the other one still remains to be able to provide service to my clients, and also for load balancing, so that I don't have one very, very busy domain controller servicing all the requests in the domain. And that's a little bit relative to the size of your network. In small environments, it might be acceptable to have only one, especially if cost is an issue and you can't afford the additional hardware. But anyway, I'm going to enter in any domain in the forest where I plan to install this domain controller. The reason why it says any domain and not the forest root is simply because it only needs to identify an existing domain in the forest to be able to trace it back to the forest root. But in my case, I only have one anyway, nuggetlab.com, and I'm going to go ahead and enter those in. Now, can't use the current credentials because they're local to this computer. So I'm going to need domain credentials. So I'll click on Set here, and I'll enter in for nuggetlab.com an account that I commonly use, and a password. And then we'll click OK, and next through the wizard. And then it finds the forest here, the forest root, which is what I want. I didn't get any error messages. That's always a good thing. Then specify which site I want it to belong to. The default site is default first site name. That, of course, can be renamed later on to make it more intuitive, but it's okay for now. And then as we click on Next, we'll just go on through the same options that we saw earlier here. And again, we get the delegation issue. Once again, I'm just going to go ahead and click on Yes to continue here because we'll talk about delegations and DNS in a future nugget. But for the time being, we'll just go ahead and continue on. And then we'll just enter in a password. Oops, if I can type right. And then we'll just go ahead and click on Next and Finish, and that would be that. Now, once again, I've already created a file that exports all of these settings, so I'm just going to go ahead and cancel this for the time being, but certainly I could have continued with that. Instead, I'm going to use my Install Peer item right here, and this is going to be very similar to what we've already looked at, so I'm not going to elaborate too much more on this, but I do like to install by text file, by answer file, whenever I can. So I'm going to go ahead and use this item. And then we'll go ahead and launch the installation, and it uses all the same options that I just showed you. This file will also be available for you to examine up on nuggetlab.com. Now then, here again, I've gone to yet another computer here, and with this one, I'm just going to show you quickly how we would install a child domain in the same forest, in a tree. So here we would just go ahead and click on Next, and we'll just go through the common settings we've seen before. And I've already pre-filled the answers in, by the way, for expediency's sake, but we'll create a new domain in an existing forest. Okay, so this is going to be a child domain in this case. This could also be a new domain in an existing forest in a different namespace. Could be a totally different name, and it might not end in nuggetlab.com. In my case, it's going to, but you could have done that as well. And then we'll have the name of the domain forest right here, and then some credentials to be able to query against. And we'll click on Next. And here's the fully qualified domain name of the parent with the single label DNS name of the child domain. And you can see down here how this is going to look once the domain is completely installed. Then you click on Next. And what it's doing here, by the way, I don't know if you noticed that, but it said it was validating the domain name. This is using an operations master role where it checks with something called the domain naming master role. And this is a role that identifies whether or not there are already other domains by the same name that I'm trying to install here, because it prevents me from installing two domains of the same exact name, and that would of course cause confusion and some problems. And that's pretty much it. The rest of the wizard is mostly the same as what we've seen in the past, so I'm going to go ahead and cancel this and point out that I did at the end of this already in advance have created a text file for this installation, much like the other ones that we can use. Do notice this, by the way. The password here, I entered that in after the fact, because even in the wizard, if I enter in the password, it does not save the password for security purposes out here to this plain text file, because anybody with Notepad can read this thing and see what my password is. So I've entered in the password items here after the fact. Also, once I run this, and again I can use this syntax right up here to be able to run this. Once I run this and it's completed using this answer file, it will then automatically go in and remove these passwords. So it's kind of an ingenious method to make sure that we don't accidentally leave remnants behind that could compromise the security of our systems. Alright, then here now I've skipped ahead to the reboot, and we see that Server Manager here does identifies this computer as dcnugget3. And here's our new domain, west.nuggetlab.com. So there's our child portion of the domain right here. And remember, since I promoted this to a domain controller in the same forest as nuggetlab.com, I'll be able to access resources throughout this forest quite easily. So for example, and we'll get into possibly this a little bit later on, but let's even say I had a folder that I was sharing here. Let's just say it's whatever this is. If I wanted to share this, what's the advantage of being able to have this child domain in the forest? Well, if I decide to add somebody, I'll just click on this little drop-down list and choose Find. And then I want to go ahead and find somebody to share this to. Maybe I want to find somebody in nuggetlab.com or west.nuggetlab.com. If I click on Locations, notice that I can search either nuggetlab.com users, these built-in users or these users, or I can search out of west.nuggetlab.com, and I can look for users here or any other OUs that I create, or these users. So it's very handy to be able to access users or computers from both domains. And I haven't really addressed sharing here, but if I were to complete that share, that would simply mean that people that I select would be able to access this folder over the network. And at the same time, if we really do need that autonomy of having our own domain in west.nuggetlab.com, we get that. We have our own domain admins, we have our own maybe administrative staff, we have maybe other reasons. For example, if it was a traditional Windows Server 2003 domain, maybe we had to put it up because we needed a different domain password policy. And there's still some call for that in 2008 as well. So, or it could be political. But anyway, regardless, we do now have a child domain created. Now then, switching gears here, I've gone to a Windows Server 2003 domain controller. What if I wanted to upgrade this to Windows Server 2008? Then would it be able to accept Windows Server 2003's Active Directory that we're looking at right here? Well, in fact, it would not be able to do so because this is an older version of the schema, and I need to update both the domain and the schema to a newer version. So we'll need to be able to do that. The same would also be true if I just left this domain controller as is, and I installed a new Windows Server 2008 domain computer in the network, and I wanted to run DC Promo on that Windows Server 2008 server and make it another peer domain controller in this same domain. Well, see, again, that wouldn't work either because I still have this old version of the schema. So that's going to have to get updated. First of all, let's confirm the version of Windows we're on. And you can see here that I've typed in WinVer from a command prompt, and indeed, I'm on Windows Server 2003 R2 Enterprise Edition. That doesn't matter in particular, but I am on Windows Server 2003's version of the OS. And then I mentioned the schema is outdated. Let me also show you this. Regedit. See, I'm going to do this from memory, so hopefully I'm doing this right. You don't have to memorize what I'm about to show you for the exam purposes, but I'm just demonstrating that we're on the wrong version of the schema for an update. So it's HKey local machine, system, current control set, and then we'll go down here to services, and then NTDS. Let's see if I can get down there somewhere. NTDS, and then parameters. There it is. Okay, what we see here is the schema version is version 31, and that's a representation of Windows Server 2003's schema. But that needs to be version 44. Now, I can't just go in here and change it to 44 in decimal. I can't just do that. What I've got to do is to run a special command from the command prompt to get it there. Now, I didn't really mention what this is, and in case you're not familiar with the registry, just in brief, by the way, what this is it controls many aspects of the operating system, and it gives it the values that it needs to be able to run properly. For example, one of the key components that I think I mentioned earlier in a previous nugget was that Active Directory is really just the ntds.dit file. Well, the way that we can identify that in the registry is right here. It points right to the ntds.dit, and that's how Active Directory knows where to find the ntds.dit file and which one is actually the DSA database file, and there it is. So that's just another example. Again, you don't have to memorize any of this, but the registry controls large aspects of how the operating system works. So what I need to do to update the schema is put the Windows Server 2008 DVD in the drive, and then I've changed to the sources AD-prep directory, and then we have to run really two commands, and then we would do AD-prep /forest prep. Okay, and then once that has run successfully, then the next thing we will do is to run AD-prep /domain prep. And then from that point forward, we'll be able to install Windows Server 2008 servers in the network, promote them to peer domain controllers in the same domain, or upgrade this existing server to Windows Server 2008. And then you can see also, if you look at the instructions, I needed to press C to continue. We don't really have any Windows 2000 domain controllers, so it's not relevant in our case. So I'll just type C and press Enter. And then we'll see that it starts to go ahead and update the schema. These LDF files are all files that are located in the same directory that we're currently operating out of, by the way. And it's going to just update them. And when it's done with this, I'm going to quickly pause recording here for now. But when it's done with this, I'm going to run the AD-prep domain prep as well, and then we'll be finished. Okay, I did run that, and it took a while to run AD-prep /forest prep, and now I've got AD-prep /domain prep. That's how you'll type that in. And then I've also added onto this another item I didn't mention before, but that's the GP prep. What that does is it changes permissions on group policy objects, which we'll explore in a future nugget. But for the time being, just know that you do have to do these here items as well. And there's probably more emphasis here for the domain prep and the forest prep on the exam. But I'll go ahead and run those, and when we're done, we'll take a look and see that our schema has been updated. All right, well, I ran the tools that I showed you there in the window, so now I'm going to go to regedit, and this also takes us right back to the last known place that we were, so it kind of remembers where we were there. And then we see now the schema version, if I can double-click on it, has indeed been updated to version 44, if we look at it in decimal. I find decimals a lot easier to read than hex, because I don't normally think in, those hex terms, but there's our schema version, and we're good to go. Now, we've talked about installing Active Directory a number of different ways, but we may also need to uninstall Active Directory from time to time. And how are you going to do that? Well, you basically do it using the same tool. Here I've gone to my west.nuggetlab.com domain controller, and let's say here that I need to uninstall Active Directory. Well, I would just use the same tool, DC Promo, and press Enter. And having done that, then it will just take me through the wizard, and I will answer a few questions related to uninstalling of the DC Promo here. So here we see it's an Active Directory domain controller. That's fine. We already know that. We'll click on Next. This is just saying that this is a global catalog server. This is a critical role that exists in the forest that allows us to find objects throughout the forest. Okay. Also, I can say delete the domain because this is the last server in the domain. And this in turn is then going to delete all records of all accounts that have been created since we installed this domain controller. And then we simply click on Next. Here we have a replica of application directory partitions. Again, we'll talk more about that when we talk about DNS a little bit later on. But this is something that's used to identify this domain. Then as we click on Next, I'm going to delete all the application directory partitions. I'm just going to clean it up. Probably wouldn't really have to do that, but just to make sure that I get a clean uninstall, I'm going to go ahead and select that option there as well. I can also use my existing credentials because I'm logged on as an administrator in this case, and then we'll click on Next, and then we'll go ahead and delete the delegations pointing to this server as well. So then we'll go ahead and next through that as well, and then we'll enter in credentials for the zone, and that would again be, and I think I'm remembering this right. Hopefully I haven't forgotten my password, okay? And then we'll enter in the new administrator account password for this server. And then that's pretty much it. Also, if we want to decommission a number of servers, notice that we can also export these settings. I found out that these seem to be a little bit iffy. Sometimes they don't quite uninstall very well, but you can give it a shot if you want to. At least the option is there. It might require a little bit of tweaking in that text file, though, to get it to work in certain instances. And then again, we can just reboot on completion again when we're complete. In this nugget, we talked about installing Active Directory, and even though we installed Active Directory in our last nugget, we took a couple of different turns here in this particular nugget. For example, we added a peer domain controller. This is going to be an additional domain controller to help provide domain services to your network, and also to provide load balancing and failover. We also took a look at a child domain, which is part of a tree infrastructure here, and this is where we installed west.nuggetlab.com. And this might be for a different division of your company, or you might have some other logical reason for installing an additional domain instead of an additional peer domain controller, and we discussed some of that in the last nugget. We also talked here about upgrading. Now, upgrading is actually a pretty lengthy process. It takes quite a lot longer than a normal install. And the key thing to keep in mind here is the installation is really pretty easy. The key thing to keep in mind, though, is preparing Active Directory if you're going to upgrade an Active Directory domain controller from, say, Windows Server 2003 to Windows Server 2008. Remember, you have to use the AD prep command to be able to do that, along with the switches that were in the materials that I showed you there. And then also, we took a look at removing Active Directory, and sometimes you'll have to do that. Might need to decommission a server, for example, or maybe you need to repurpose a server. If you don't properly remove it from Active Directory, then the other domain controllers throughout your forest will expect to see that domain controller there and attempt to replicate to it and communicate with it, and it'll just run into error after error after error because it can never contact it. So make sure you properly remove Active Directory when it's necessary. Well, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.